Welcome to the Primary Sources podcast for Viral History. My name is Joanne Paul, and I am here to chat with some of the world's leading historians. Not just about what they do, the histories they study, the stories they tell, but how they do it. And for goodness sake, why they do it. I'm interested in motivations and approaches, and how they came to find themselves buried in the past in the first place. Today we are very fortunate to welcome the master of history podcasts himself, the one, the only, Greg Jenner. Welcome, Greg, and thank you for being here.
Hello, thank you for having me.
You were one of the first names that popped into my head when we decided to do this podcast, so I'm so pleased we were able to make it happen.
Yes, I apologise in advance of my cold. I have a small toddler, and she has given me her lurgy, so I am a sniffly, snuffly hoarse man today.
Absolutely, not a problem. Greg, for those who might not know, has a long and, may I say, very distinguished career in public history, having worked on Horrible Histories, including the film. And you did have a cameo in that film as well, right?
Yeah, it's an in-joke that no one got except basically those who know me very closely. I played Emperor Nero's historian, and so I got to be a historian on screen who watches Emperor Nero fall down the stairs. So it was sort of an in-joke that only I really laughed at. But yeah, it was fun to do.
Do you still have the costume, or did you have to give that back?
Sadly not. Sadly, it was a loan costume. It was filmed in Bulgaria. It was very nice, but unfortunately, I do not get to walk around in a toga.
That is unfortunate. I mean, this is a podcast, so you could just claim to be wearing it now. So no one would know. And he's also currently host of two very successful podcasts, You're Dead to Me and Homeschool History. If that weren't enough, Greg is also the author of two books, A Million Years in a Day and Dead Famous, and, if his Twitter is to be believed, has just finished two more books. Greg, you okay?
Yes, I stopped work 3 days ago, so you have caught me on a sort of a weird sort of rebound high. I think I'm sort of giddy with delight that I'm not at work today.
Or it's the cold medicine.
It could be the cold medicine. It might be the paracetamol. It may be I'm a little bit hyperactive and a bit delusional. But yeah, I've written a book in lockdown for grown-ups, and then I've written a children's book as well, which will be illustrated, which will be really fun as well.
Well, that leads me to my first question perfectly. You have done a lot of work, Horrible Histories, Homeschool History, and then this new book on making history engaging for kids. What's your own first memory of being really interested in or struck by history, and what was it that engaged you?
I get this question a lot, actually, and I try not to give a kind of stock answer because I think that's a slightly... You can get a little bit stuck in repeating yourself, and actually, I think when I look back, I don't necessarily know if there was a single moment. What I do remember a lot of my childhood was being particularly kind of fascinated by World War II because my grandpa would talk about it a lot, and he'd been in the RAF, and he'd talk about Spitfires and sorts of things like that. And I remember being acutely kind of fascinated by medieval knights and sort of chivalric tales. I had little toy knights, and I grew up in Kent, and our local castle, it's called Bodiam Castle.
I know it well. It's a gorgeous castle.
It's a beautiful castle, and what's lovely about it is it's got all its crenellations, it's got a moat, it's sort of been restored, so it's not really authentic, but it looks like the definitive Disney castle that when you're a kid is just super exciting. And so I think growing up in my sort of childhood rather than teens, I think I found history to be quite romantic and quite exciting, quite boyish in my sort of interest in military things, knights and swords and axes and planes and battleships and stuff like that. But I'm also half French, and so my mother is from Paris, and so I sort of grew up also kind of aware that the French viewed history differently to the British, which was always quite fun growing. You could have these sort of fun arguments with, well, I say fun, sometimes I could annoy my mum on purpose by bringing up Waterloo or Wellington or whatever I wanted to do to poke her, and she'd respond with Napoleon and various other sort of Joan of Arc references. But I think growing up in a household where history was an argument that could be had actually also gave me quite an interesting sort of sense that the past was debatable and open to open to sort of investigation and wasn't necessarily kind of categorically true, if that makes sense. So there was a sort of scope to think about it and kind of go, really? So I think that was quite important. And then the thing that really sucked me in, I think, was my love of comedy. Your listeners probably don't know that much about me because I'm not very well known, but the kind of stuff I work on is comedy, it's humour, it's pop culture, it's sort of joyous and making things fun. And so in my teens, I fell in love with Eddie Izzard and the Goons and Peter Cook and Dudley Moore and Monty Python, and also Maid Marian and Her Merry Men, which is a sitcom made by Tony Robinson back in the day, which had a kind of feminist Maid Marian and an idiot Robin Hood. And those things kind of fixed my brain into the idea that the past was fun and playful and a world of ideas and discrepancies and curious ways of thinking, and people in the past were different. But also because I was so interested in comedy, and so I found it such fun and so richly surprising, that it also started to get my brain going in terms of reinterpreting the past. You know, the fact that people in the past thought differently to us. They had different logics, different rules, different scientific approaches, and I think that's where you can probably trace most of my adult career back to, is that sort of watershed moment of discovering Eddie Izzard and the Goons and Python, and going, yeah, that's what I want to do, really.
Certainly both of your books are very funny, as well as being insightful and interesting. What is the key to finding humor in history?
Oh, I don't know. Goodness. I mean, there's that old catchphrase, isn't it, that dissecting a joke is like dissecting a frog. The frog dies and no one laughs. But there's, I suppose, what I love about using humour to engage with history is that I take history extremely seriously. You know, it's my life, it's my job, it's my passion. But that doesn't mean that you have to be straight-faced about it. For me, comedy isn't belittling the past. It isn't undermining or being silly. It's a technique. I think of it in the same way that writing well is a technique. You know, when you're writing for a general audience, you try and write with flair and with excitement and not use big, complicated jargon. So I use comedy as a technique to try and make history accessible, particularly to those who find history intimidating or off-putting, or they didn't enjoy it at school, or they're young and they haven't really even thought about history yet. So a lot of what I do is trying to find analogous humour. So a lot of what we do on Horrible Histories or on Homeschool History, which is the children's podcast on the BBC, is trying to find sort of pop culture references that feel familiar, that allow you to sort of say, well, look, it's just like this. And that's quite a simple technique. It's not hugely sophisticated, but it's quite effective. And it allows you to very quickly introduce an idea which would be unfamiliar, and then to pair it up with something that the child or your listener, who might be an adult, will know and kind of go, oh, great, okay, that makes sense. So it can be as simple as saying Queen Cleopatra is a bit like Lady Gaga, because they're both famed for extraordinary fashion. They're both, you know, if you watch their music videos, men are always dying in the Lady Gaga classic videos of the sort of 2010s. She's always poisoning her lovers. And of course, Cleopatra bumped off a few fellows in her life. So there are sometimes very simple parallels that allow you into a joke. Sometimes it's a way of using heightened language. Sometimes it's the complexity or absurdity of a situation that allows you to have fun with how hard something is. You can find a joke in something being too difficult to explain quickly, and that can become a joke itself. You know, I think early on in series 1 of Horrible Histories, we tried to explain the causes of the First World War, and which is a very hard thing to explain because it's a sort of domino effect. You've got international alliances and rivalries. You've got, you know, the Soviets sort of fearing, well, not quite Soviets yet, but the Russians fearing, you know, the Austrians fearing the British, the Germans wanting naval supremacy and you've got an awful lot of sort of jostling. If you turn it into a playground sort of fight about who's mates with who, it kind of gets absurd, but it also starts to make sense about who's on which team, and so you can find ways to explain very complicated things with things that feel accessible and ordinary, and visual sometimes as well. You know, Horrible Histories people often say, oh, it's a historical sketch show. And I go, yeah, of course it is. Absolutely. It's a show where absolutely everything you see is about history. But if you watch it with the sound off, it's a parody of 21st century aesthetics. You know, we mock TV shows, adverts, pop music. We do game shows. We do movie trailers. Absolutely everything in that show is in some ways reacting to the world that children are growing up in. And a lot of the comedy comes from the familiar and the grammar of the television and the pop culture and the YouTube stuff that they are watching. So by using a YouTube clip, children know how YouTube works. They know the grammar of it, they know the logic of it, they know the formal introductory, they know the kind of, hi guys, I'm a YouTuber, I talk like this. And so by essentially Trojan horsing your history facts into something that makes sense and is familiar, children relax into it, they are having a nice time, but they're also actually much more receptive to these complicated new ideas you're giving them because they are already comfortable. They know what they're getting. They're already in something that makes sense to them. And so the historical information that you're delivering is coming in a form that, you know, really feels like, oh yeah, I get this. I know what this is. It's a YouTube sketch. Great, lovely, no problem at all. So comedy is a fantastic device for delivering the difficult because it makes it fun, it makes you smile, but it's also actually about sort of sliding it in a slightly less, you know, there's less chafing as it goes in. There's a bit more of a kind of joy to it, but there's also an ease that it comes in because we know what to expect next. That's
Well,
a
the
long answer.
analogy itself, no, thank you.
Sorry.
No, that's really, really helpful. The analogy itself is somehow funny as well. As soon as you suggested that Lady Gaga and Cleopatra had things in common, I found myself sort of laughing a little bit because
Yeah.
history all of a sudden came down to earth and into my world in a way that is almost a little bit funny. So it's a great way of, as you say, getting kids into history and teaching them almost as default. um, do you find that there's much of a difference when you're writing material about history for kids as when you're writing history for adults?
Honestly, I'm not sure how to answer that, to be honest, because I have to work extremely hard on both, and I'm not sure if I don't know if there's a difference in my technique. You have to be really aware with children that okay, so the first thing to say is with children, the first rule is don't patronize them because they switch off really quickly if it feels too kiddie. Kids are super smart. They're amazingly perceptive and they are much more knowledgeable than we give them credit sometimes. And they often are aspiring upwards to things that are slightly beyond their age range. So on Horrible Histories, on Homeschool, when writing for children, I always aim a little bit above their heads. And I try and explain everything I say. So it's about sort of introducing ideas, introducing language, introducing terminology, and then explaining it. So you say, you know, I was going to say feudalism actually, but feudalism is a terrible example because feudalism is enormously debated by historians, and we're not even sure if it's a real thing. So I won't use feudalism.
I would get you on that one as well.
Let's back away from feudalism. Let's say instead, you know, the idea perhaps even of revolution, or of, you know, when you're trying to explain. You know, we did the space race as an episode on Homeschool History, and we had 13 minutes to try and explain the space race. And about a minute and a half in, you have to sort of go, yeah, well, it's basically an ideological war about whose economic system is better, capitalism or communism. And then you sort of think, well, this is an 8-year-old. Do they know what either of those are? Right, okay, what's capitalism in a sentence? What's communism in a sentence? And you very quickly find yourself going, right, yeah, that's hard. But you can't go bigger than the simplicity because it just bogs down the comedy. So you have to give them the very sort of basic introduction, and that is that communism is a system where, in theory, everyone should have equal access to resources, and the society should be without rich and poor, and, you know, and there's a sort of top-down control, but ultimately there's a sort of leveling effect. Whereas capitalism is more about, you know, profit and you know, ingenuity and new ideas, and people should earn more for their better ideas. And you're sort of trying to sort of say, oh, it's enormously complicated, but here's what you need to know, just so you can get to the next bit. Obviously, when you're dealing with adults, when you're doing a podcast for adults, there's a sort of assumption that most people know what you're talking about. But actually, that's not really true a lot of the time. And Adults are, of course, incredibly smart and knowledgeable, but I think I find myself quite often trying to just ensure that there's a sort of base level of knowledge built into my script of stuff. So quite a lot of what I do on You're Dead to Me is I sort of repeat back what the historian has said in slightly simpler language, just in case. So, sometimes a historian will, in case people haven't heard, actually, You're Dead to Me is a 45 minutes, 50 minutes of funny chat between myself as host. We get on an expert historian with a PhD, and we get on a top comedian, and the three of us have a very funny chat for 45 minutes about a different subject. And the historian really is the star of the show. The comedian, on the face of it, is the star of the show because they're the famous one who's got, the glamour and whatever. But really, the historian is the star. The historian gets about 65% of the airtime. And sometimes the historians are fantastic at explaining themselves, and you just go, yep, amazing, brilliant, moving on. And occasionally they are a little bit still in the sort of, academic mode, and they've said a big word, or they've used a terminology, and I just sort of will then try and gloss it in a slightly, just a very quick, unpatronising way of just saying, yeah, of course, what you mean by that is this. Because if you say to someone the dissolution of the monasteries, and they haven't done A-level history, that doesn't mean anything. I mean, that, as far as they're aware,
just images of monasteries dissolving into
yeah, exactly that.
tea.
Yeah. It's sort of like Alka-Seltzer. They just sort of bubble away. And even if you say the Reformation, that can mean anything. And if you say the English Republic, that can mean anything at all. There are phrases that we as historians are very comfortable with, and to the point that they're almost sort of cliche. But there are phrases the general public will stare at you and go, what? And you go, oh yeah, that's a good point, sorry. So occasionally my job is sort of translator a little bit, and just trying to make something a little bit more simplified. But actually, a huge amount of what we do on You're Dead to Me is just allow the historians to be themselves, because the comedian acts as the kind of the voice of the people, really. The comedian is there to be funny, to be silly, but also to keep us in check. And if we lose the comedian, we know we've lost the audience. So the way that program is built is that you get the best of both worlds. The comedian both gives you your levity, your laughs, your joy, and gives you a new audience, because the comedian brings some of their listeners, their fans in, which is fab. But they also are sort of the guinea pig, the canary in the coal mine, where if their eyes are glazing over, we're going to go, oh, no, okay, we've lost them. So it's a really useful device, because it feels a little bit like a sort of an undergraduate seminar sometimes, but at the same time, you're always in your head thinking, okay, but there's 500,000 people listening to this. How do we make sure that each one of them is enjoying it and isn't going to be lost by this?
Well, as you said, it's had a wonderful, what's the word, listenership? I don't know what the word is.
Yeah,
but it's been
audience,
highly,
maybe, yeah.
Audience, I guess, but it's been highly successful. And I wish that my undergraduate seminars that I teach were as entertaining as You're Dead to Me is. Maybe I need to hire some comedians to come in and join me.
Well, they're very lovable comedians, but they're a funny bunch, and so it's yeah. I mean, the lovely thing about You're Dead to Me is that it was an instant hit, which none of us expected. But it went to #1 4 days after it launched, which was ridiculous. But it very quickly proved my point that the public aren't stupid, and they really want to know more, and that they are actually very interested in the more diverse and global stories that they don't get given very often. And we have a rule on the show that we don't do Tudors and we don't do World War II, because those things are so well catered for. It's not that they're not interesting, of course they're interesting, but they're just so well catered for elsewhere that it's like, well, okay, we'll do something else. So it's really reassuring that this sort of mad experiment where we were like, okay, all our guests have to have PhDs and we'll get professors on and it'll be really, really fun, but actually properly highbrow. Actually, we found that the audiences are incredibly receptive to hearing not just about eras they don't know much about or subjects they don't know much about, whether it's West African history or the Haitian Revolution or Tang Dynasty China. They're also interested in the nuance window, which is the section at the end where the historian is allowed 2 minutes to talk about the historiography and to talk about the problematic perceptions of how we've come to this understanding of this subject and what's happened during the past 100 years where, there have been revisionism, there has been discursive sort of back and forth between two schools of historians who fought over the legacy of this person. And that doesn't usually go in a podcast, let alone a comedy show. Ours is a comedy show. It's advertised as a comedy show, and yet at the heart of it actually is it. We try and make sure that it feels like basically a university lecture with jokes, and hopefully that's the best of both worlds. The thing I love about doing You're Dead to Me is that I don't have to be the fount of knowledge, because I don't have sufficient knowledge sometimes to go deep into a subject and give you the nuances and the depth. I am very comfortable giving you the kind of superficial surface. Here's the sort of general gist of a subject. And that's what I do a lot of the time on Twitter and so on. But You're Dead to Me is wonderful because I get to bring on genuine experts, and the quality of their scholarship and their knowledge and their passion is so much richer than what I could do. And there's quite a lot of podcasts out there where it's the same people week after week talking about history, and they care about it a lot, and they've read some books, and it's lovely. But what I really love doing as a public historian is taking the step back and being a facilitator and using my platform to allow other scholars to be the star of a show. And we often on You're Dead to Me will book people who've never been on a podcast. They've never been on a BBC documentary. They've never had the opportunity. And they're amazing. They're so funny and insightful and knowledgeable and good at chatting about stuff. And you just go, why haven't they been given their own thing? So it's a real delight to not only get out the way, because I know that I have big holes in my knowledge, but also just to sort of go, ladies and gentlemen, this person who's amazing, you should follow them and read their books. And that's a really lovely privilege that I get to do. And the comedians often react so beautifully to being in a room with someone so smart. And you can see they very quickly form a little friendship and sometimes they gang up on me. Actually, it was very funny. If you listen to the Gráinne O'Malley episode, which is about the 16th century Irish pirate queen, you'll hear the comedian Catherine and the historian Gillian just ganging up on me about 2 minutes in, and then stealing the podcast off me. It's absolutely hilarious. I loved it. It was a fantastic day. So,
well, then you definitely aren't the center of things if
no,
that happens.
I became the bad boy. Because they're both Irish, and I was the bad Englishman. So it was a very funny episode. But it's such a lovely thing where you see historians, comedians very quickly respect each other's work, respect how they think. They suddenly discover they think very similarly. Historians, comedians think very similarly. They've got very similar brains. They love to pull things apart, ask questions, and they're very good communicators. It's so nice to see that organic chemistry just happen in front of your eyes. And I'm looking down at my script, and sometimes I'm like, don't need that, because it's just happening without my prompting. And that's such a lovely thing to be the host of a show where these historians get to be the star, and where the comedians get to realize how smart they are, and that history is a fascinating, rich subject. So yeah, that's why I love doing it.
You do need both, though, that broad knowledge and that specific knowledge. It's interesting. I was finishing up a lecture today where we were talking about the fox and the hedgehog. Are you aware of this?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, now I'll see if I get it right. The hedgehog knows one big thing and the fox knows many small things, or maybe I have that backwards. But the ideal historian is able to bring together both the broad sort of understanding of the past and these very small specific things. And then I always put up a picture of Sonic the Hedgehog and his little fox friend. And this is the perfect historian is Sonic the Hedgehog and sidekick.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether I'm a sidekick or maybe I'm more Mario. I don't know. But it's a fascinating process to do a show for the general public who you assume don't know very much, but then to bring on an expert who knows absolutely everything, and then to bring in a comedian who has questions, and then I can sometimes answer those questions. And so occasionally I can step in and I can be quite sort of, I get to be a bit like, oh, I know this stuff too. And it's nice, from time to, we did the Blackbeard episode, and we had a fantastic pirate historian on who it works on piracy, but we were talking about the reign of Queen Anne, and our comedian Stu said, well, what else is interesting about the reign of Queen Anne? And I got to go, well, actually, copyright law. It's an amazingly interesting time for the evolution of copyright law and the evolution of the first ever newspaper, the daily newspaper, 1702, the Daily Current. It's the first time you get daily newspapers, and that changes the culture. And suddenly here's a pirate celebrity, and it changes the dynamic. And Stu was like, oh, cool, so he's a celebrity. And I was like, yeah, he's a celebrity. And it was just very nice to suddenly find that I could contribute something useful to it as well. And Stu was asking questions that were really perceptive and insightful. And then our pirate historian was able to sort of talk about Blackbeard, the man, the myth, the legend. And yeah, all three of us had something to bring to it. And it lifted it into a kind of really nice discussion rather than just sort of, here's someone smart telling you things. It was kind of, yeah, it felt like we all had a kind of a leg. A leg? No, that's not right. we were a tripod with three legs. No, that's a terrible analogy, Greg. Shut up. But yeah, we all had something to bring that brought joy and knowledge to the listeners.
We've talked about your podcasts. I want to ask you now about your books. I absolutely devoured your first book, A Million Years in a Day, when it came out. I don't think I quite read it in a day, which is probably the way that you're meant to do it, but it was very close. How did you come to that idea of talking through basically the whole of human history as a day in the life?
It took a while. I had the subtitle, or I had the kind of the sub-subtitle in my head as a sort of guiding principle initially, which was Stone Age to Phone Age. That was a sort of pithy little line. I was like, oh, I like that. That's cute. That kind of sums up my interests because I kind of do a bit of everything, and we were trying to find the kind of ideal container for this. So like, how do you write a book where you're trying to do the Stone Age to the Phone Age, and it took a while to sort of figure it out, but I realized that ultimately I was trying to write a book for people who don't read history books. The idea was to write a book for someone who had never read a history book in their life. What would I want them to get out of it? And how would I write it so they wouldn't be intimidated in page one? And so very quickly I decided, okay, well, I'm going to write it in a second person style. So I'll be talking about you and or we, I'll put myself in the book, but I'll say you might not do this or you might not do this. So trying to make it feel conversational. But I also realized that the thing that is the most universal, the thing that is the most easily accessible, the thing that we can all do, is to sort of talk about our own lives and what do we all do, what do we all experience. And of course, once I realized that, I then thought, well, actually, that's a really lovely device because it allows me then to do global history because these things are universal. And they go around the world, and so it doesn't matter if you're in Bronze Age Pakistan or if you're in Aztec Mexico or if you're in 17th century Japan. We all need to brush our teeth or go to the loo or have lunch or put clothes on so that people don't point at us and go, he's naked. And so actually it kind of became a sort of almost like a rolling stone that gathered momentum. Once I had that tiny little idea of doing something universal that felt everyday, suddenly it was like, oh no, literally every day. It needs to just be a Saturday in your life, the reader, your ordinary life, where I try and talk you through all the things that you probably do on a Saturday and explain that those things have come from somewhere else. And that then allowed me into a very broad global history that is also a micro history, which is a sort of it's a weird gimmick, but I think it worked, hopefully.
Oh, absolutely. And it was very successful as well. And your second book was about celebrity. So you went from everyday life to celebrity, which is not most people's everyday lives. What do you see as the common thread that runs between those two books? Or are they, in fact, very, very different?
I mean, that's a good point, actually. And I suppose the reason I picked it was that I was looking for a second book that would feel universal. And yet you're right, of course, we're not all celebrities. Although Andy Warhol might have argued otherwise, that we'd all get our 15 minutes. Although in my epilogue I argue he's wrong. But what I was looking for was a book that would sort of build on what I'd done first time around, which was explain that history is much more complicated and nuanced than we often give it credit. And that many of the ideas that we think of as modern have a much deeper, richer history and can be tracked back further than you might expect. And I was looking for something that would be fun and universal and interesting to a broad readership. So we all love celebrity culture. And if we don't love celebrity culture, you can often be quite sniffy about it, quite snooty about it, and a bit like, oh, blooming celebrities. In which case, there's a sort of oppositional angle there where I'm sort of trying to say, you're wrong, actually. This is much more interesting than you're giving it credit. So there's a sort of double effort there to try and hook in people who hate celebrities and people who love celebrity culture. but I was trying to write a book that would also, to a certain extent, was a sort of an exercise in my own frustrated ego, in that people don't take me seriously sometimes as a historian, which I understand, because a lot of what I do is jokes and silly and fun and podcasting and children's stuff and comedy, and I look like an idiot and I behave like an idiot most of the time on Twitter. But I am really, really in love with history. I'm deeply nerdy. If you put me in a room with historians, I read 300 history books a year quite comfortably, and I wanted to do a PhD and couldn't afford it, and wanted to be an academic, and I was going to be a medieval historian looking at 13th century romantic literature. That was going to be my thing. So there's a part of me that's a little bit frustrated that I didn't get to be the kind of proper serious historian who who writes monographs. But there's also quite a wide chunk of my brain that is taken up with the kind of the sense that these things matter, these things are important, and that we don't give them enough thought, and that something like celebrity culture, which is so important in our society, it's so dominant, it's a multi-billion-pound industry, hugely lucrative, it governs all sorts of aspects of our life that we don't even think about. Celebrities influence vaccine uptake, they influence politics, they influence our attitude towards sex and gender and death and rock and roll and drug taking and drink driving. They tell us what to wear, what not to wear. They tell us what is an acceptable or unacceptable opinion. They are these very important bellwethers in our social constructions of right and wrong, and in that sort of functional sociology sort of sense that Durkheim argued for. And so they're really, really important, but we don't think about them enough. And they don't have a kind of intellectual history that is established enough. Now, some historians have been doing this stuff for 20 years. I'm not saying I'm new, but no one had done a book for the general public that was speaking to ordinary people and saying, this comes from somewhere. The world you live in has a heritage, and it's not just Elvis. It's not just Marilyn Monroe. When we talk about the history of celebrity, it's not just Charlie Chaplin. This goes back to the 1700s, easily to the 1700s, and thereafter you can start to make arguments. So my book makes the argument for 1709 as my first celebrity. Within it, I try to explore the arguments made by some other scholars going earlier, 17th century. I'm like, well, maybe, but I don't think so. Medieval saints has been put forward, which is a very interesting argument, which I don't quite agree with, but I did enjoy debating it. And then there are a couple of classicists who'd say, well, gladiators and Roman charioteers, why not them? And again, I explored that idea and said, I don't think so, but it's fun. It was a real joy and a real headache to do this book because I thought it would be easy, and it was the hardest thing I've ever done. It took me 4 years, full time. I had 1.4 million words of notes, and it was a PhD essentially. It was that level of depth of research. I read over 1,000 things, books, journal articles, PhD theses, historical newspaper archives and magazines and all sorts of things. And primarily I was processing other people's scholarship. It was synthesis. It's a work of synthesis where I compiled an enormous amount of stuff and then looked at it and went, well, what do I reckon this means? So it's my argument based on other people's research. So I'm not really an archival historian, and I never would claim to be that. Actually, I'm a public historian. A lot of what I do is trying to find ways to broadcast what other people have done and make it just feel a little bit more warm and welcoming to an audience who might be scared. But with Dead Famous, I realised that I had to stick my neck out and actually argue for what I believed and what I thought I could stand up, and what where I thought historians had gone wrong, where I thought people had made a case and I don't think that stands up. I think this is wrong. So I had to define what celebrity was. And bizarrely, no one agrees what celebrity is, which is mad, because we all know what a celebrity is. If I say to you, what's a celebrity, you'd be like, well, it's a famous person. I'd be like, yeah, but what is a famous person? You'd be like, well, it's a famous person. I'd be like, yeah, but what is a... And it took me 8 months to come up with a working definition for the thing I was writing a book about, which is much too hard. It was bizarrely taxing. And I was like, how is it so hard? Why hasn't someone done this for me already? But that's what then made me so excited and so fascinated by the subject is that we had all been walking around using these words: celebrity, fame, renown, glory, VIP, notoriety, these synonyms, and we didn't know what they meant and where they had come from and the contradictions within them and the intellectual and cultural heritage that had given us these words and these meanings and these experiences and that economic legacy. And so I ended up falling in love with the subject and taking it much too seriously, and sort of spending 4 years of my life at war with this book. Um, and then, ironically enough, it came out 3 days before a devastating pandemic. And so it sort of arrived in the midst of a kind of global disaster. And so nobody read it initially. It's since been read a bit more, which is nice. But yeah, it was.
We're still waiting on the book launch. It will happen one
Yeah,
day.
exactly.
One day it will happen. It's interesting. You've just described Dead Famous as an intellectual history, which of course it is.
Yeah.
I describe myself as an intellectual historian, but I don't say that much to people because it's just not sexy. It's intellectual history is one of the sort of most serious, most ivory tower, stodgy
Yeah.
sort of disciplines, or at least that's how people think about it. But of course, that's exactly what intellectual history is to take these concepts that we use today that maybe we don't think that critically about. And as you say, maybe we don't even know what they mean, and then trace them back to the past, not necessarily to an origin point, but to understand the story of how they change and how they adapt. And that's exactly what Dead Famous does. So I'm going to use that in future to say, look, intellectual history can be interesting and cool and even funny.
I hope so. I mean, I think I would call it a cultural history, probably, but it is certainly, it's a history of an idea. So it's me trying to track, when did celebrity begin, and what is it, and what was before it, and why did it arrive in the first place? Why in the 1700s do I think celebrity culture suddenly comes into force? And well, I try in the book to make several claims. Other historians have done some great stuff on this. I wasn't completely original in my ideas, but I tried to make the case for it, adding my own interpretations. And also I looked at 125 celebrities from 1700 to 1950. And what was extraordinary, and what I did not expect, was the amazing repetition of the themes. And so in the end, the book was meant to be just a chronology. I was just going to start at the beginning and go to the end. And that just didn't do justice to the significance of celebrity culture. And I was like, oh, that's not working. So in the end, I ended up doing thematic chapters where each chapter was on a different substrand of what celebrity is, whether that's the economics of it or the aesthetics of it. What do celebrities look like and how do they manage that? What happens when your reputation is tarnished or destroyed? What happens when you're made famous against your will? What happens to people who try desperately to be made famous? What happens to celebrity bodies? How do we obsess and visualize and destroy the integrity of the celebrity body? And why do we do that? And when did that start happening? Who was the first person to do advertising and branded products? And so each of the chapters sort of chased this different idea, which allowed me to keep reintroducing celebrities we'd already met earlier in the book and say, he's back, she's back, here she is again. And what was so surprising was that celebrity culture in 1709 was completely the same as celebrity culture in 1949. There was nothing different about it. It arrived fully formed, and I was just startled by that. I thought it would be a kind of growing, evolving, enlarging thing, and it just wasn't. It's just there. And so that was really fun, but also very taxing, and also, I'll be honest, terrifying, because I'm not the serious historian, and people don't take me seriously, and I'm just some bloke who does a comedy podcast and who works on a children's show. And here I was going, right, you're all wrong. I've done the reading. Here is my argument. And it was very scary, very, very scary to then publish it.
That's what history should be, as you said, growing up with the idea that history can and should be debated. One of the things that I think we've come across as historians lately is this idea that we can't rewrite the past, that we can't rewrite history, that we can't engage in these debates. But it's very important that we do, and that people who have done the reading, from no matter what background, PhD or no PhD, are engaged in doing that.
Yeah, and that gets to the heart of a really important. I don't know if the phrase lack of awareness is fair, but I think there is a sense that there are these sort of solid contingent facts which exist in the ether and are just there floating, and historians pluck them down from the heavens and then put them in their book. And that completely fails to acknowledge what history is as a fundamental exercise, which is that history is interpretive. It's something historians do. It's a verb. History's a verb. It's what historians do. And so I'm always trying to gently nudge people towards the idea that the past and history are very different things, and that the past cannot be changed unless you get in a time machine and you've got a sort of a white-haired doc shouting "Marty!" But you can change history every day. Like, I change history on a daily basis. When I write a tweet, I'm changing history. There's a really big discrepancy between what the public understand the past to be and what historians understand history to be, and there's a sort of gaping chasm in the middle that we need to be better at filling, because there is a definite politicization of what's happened in the past few years, where we've seen people saying, you can't pull down statues, you're destroying history. And it's like, no, pulling down a statue is history. It's literally the work of history. And more importantly, that statue, it doesn't necessarily reflect history. It's something that was put up in the past by people who were doing their own history, their own type of history. They were commemorating something or someone, and we now perhaps feel differently about that. But it's that sense that the past belongs to all of us, and historians have a kind of curatorial role, an interpretive role, a discursive role, but at the same time, when we try and do our jobs, and that maybe runs counter to what official government sources want us to do, then we suddenly are like these sort of Stalinist monsters. And it's like, well, no, this is what we do. It's what we've always done. And perhaps we need to be more, I don't know, maybe more upfront about that, and better at explaining what we do, explaining what historians do, explaining what it's for. But there is a really interesting thing that public history, which is, I call myself a public historian. I wouldn't say I'm a historian, I'd say I'm a public historian. A lot of what I'm trying to do is to explain that, as with science, of course there are things that happened, but we only have some of the evidence. And we will discuss these things and we'll debate them, and from time to time we'll really disagree, and we'll even reinterpret things. And some subjects need a new, fresh approach, and they suddenly come alive in a different way. And they, historians ask the questions of the past because they're interested in those questions now. And so the past inevitably starts to look quite a lot like what we care about, which means there is a sort of mirror mentality there. And that's inevitable. So each generation will rewrite the past, will rewrite history to reflect their current concerns. And that's the process. And, the Greeks knew that, and we know that.
I've got 3 more questions for you, but first we're going to do the rapid fire. So
Okay.
these are questions. I'm hoping they're gonna make you think, but you have to answer quite quickly. Feel free though to give explanations. In the future, these will be crowdsourced, but because we haven't launched this podcast yet, I've come up with them. So
All right.
There's no one to blame but me. You said that you read something like 350 books a year, so that's quite a lot. So here's my first question. Would you rather be stuck on a desert island with 5 of your favorite books, or 50 books you've never read?
Oh, definitely 50 books I've never read. The joy for me is the novelty, the new, the expanding of the brain. Obviously, it's lovely to have a wonderful book that you enjoy, you love, and you can see the craftsmanship or the work, you can see the scholarship. But the thing I adore about being a historian is the enormous knowledge of how little I know. Every day you kind of go, oh, don't know anything about that. Better get a new book. So 50 new books sounds wonderful.
And being stuck on a desert island with them actually would be a nice break. It's not bad.
It depends where the island is.
Yeah,
depends
fair.
if there's a gale coming. If there's food on the island, sure.
Yes,
But yeah, definitely. I think the 50 books. I mean, as long as they're not written by Jacob Rees-Mogg. I mean, if that's, if they're all written by Jacob Rees-Mogg, I think I'll pass.
Would you rather have dinner with Lord Byron or Gene Kelly?
Oh, now this is not fair. This is so unfair. Right, okay. So I adore Gene Kelly. I did tap and ballet as a child, and Singing in the Rain is my favourite movie. And I did a Radio 4 programme about him where I learned that he was a very interesting guy, but not necessarily funny. He worked extremely hard and very kind of driven man, but not necessarily the kind of the warmest, most vivacious conversationalist. Whereas Byron, for all of his flaws and faults, terrible man in a lot of ways, but fascinating in a lot of ways too. He did hate watching women eat. So it depends if there's anyone else at the table with us. If you're joining us, for example, he's going to stare at you and he's going to be tutting, and that might be a bit awkward and not very nice. So is it just me and Byron, or is it a wider dinner party?
I think the question is just you and Byron.
Okay, I think I'll probably. They say don't meet your heroes, so I'm going to chat with Byron, and I'll leave Gene Kelly just to tap dance in my mind.
Maybe he can entertain in the evening.
Sure, yeah, if he's free.
This is a contentious one, so Twitter might get angry with you for this, but
Oh, no.
I'm gonna ask anyway. Who wins, the terrible tutors or the slimy stewards?
Then what? I mean, come on. What are we measuring? So, for those who are listening who don't know the reference, these are the Horrible Histories categories. So the children's TV show that I work on, based on Terry Deary's books. The enormous problem with this periodization, and I was actually talking on Twitter yesterday about the problem of periodization, the inherent flaws and the arbitrary boundaries of eras, is that the Stuarts and the Tudors they're one and the same, really, because the Stuarts in Scotland are living at the same time as the Tudors in England. And of course the Tudors weren't Tudors because they didn't call themselves Tudors. Henry VIII hated that name. He thought it was embarrassing and shameful. So we called them Tudors, but they didn't call themselves Tudors. And the Stuarts were living at the same time as Tudors. Mary Queen of Scots was a Stuart, but she was at the... So I see no difference between them, is what I'm saying. I'm very much going to throw your question back at you and refuse to answer.
That's fine. I tell my students all the time that to question the question is a perfectly legitimate way to answer an exam question, as long as you can back it up, and I think you've done that. So
all I will say, I'll say very quickly, is that I think the 17th century is wildly underrated for its significance in not just British history, Irish history, Scottish history, Welsh history, but also I think world history. If you look at the impact of the sort of the Ottomans, or if you're looking at obviously what's happening in continental America in the 1600s, or if you're looking in Japan, or even Mughal South Asia, the 17th century is amazing as a sort of global century, and I think it's very poorly studied and understood by the public, and I'd love to do more on it. So if you're forcing me, then I would say 17th over 16th century.
This one should be easier for you, hopefully. What's your current favorite weird historical fact?
Oh, I have way too many. So many. So many. I can't... I mean, that's just not fair. I mean, my brain is full of stupid facts. Oh, God. I mean, you say current. I mean, it changes on a daily basis. Give me a decade or an era, and I will give you a fact, and then you can.
Oh, that's fun. That's fun. Let's say early medieval.
Oh, okay. Even that's my brain's just racing.
715.
7. Oh my goodness me. No, okay. One of the facts I love at the moment, and I can't remember the name of the Islamic scholar. I think it's Ibn al-Haytham. I think. So don't quote me on this, but I think it's Ibn al-Haytham, who was an extraordinary, brilliant scholar in the probably 1,000 years ago, perhaps in the Islamic world, and he did some really interesting research, I think, into the effect of music on camels and on animals, and whether it made them walk faster. And I love that. I think that's a really wonderful exploration of animal psychology, human psychology. He was looking at to whether music can bring joy not just to humans but also to sentient souls, which gets you into a much bigger question about do animals have souls, and it's the sort of Aquinas argument and Aristotle and whatever. So that I think is quite delightful, that he was kind of going, right, what happens if I play upbeat sort of music to a donkey? Does it trot along quite happily, or does it just carry on as normal? I think that's quite cute. So I'm going to give that's my stock answer for now. But I mean, there are loads of sort of weird facts in my head that it sort of pile out at various moments, and it's very frustrating when people say, tell me your favourite fact, and I'm like, oh no, and there's a sort of bottleneck of mad, because Horrible Histories is just thousands of weird, strange facts, and it's very hard to choose them. It's not fair.
I'm very sorry. That you'll be glad to know that the quick fire is over now. So I won't force you to do any more of those. I'm going to end with 3 questions, and these are the same 3 questions I'm going to ask every time.
Okay.
The first one is, what's your favorite primary source that you've worked
on? That's a really great. I mean, that's hard, isn't it? Because favourite is does that mean the one that gave me the most sort of joy in terms of the aesthetic experience, or the one that helped me with my argument the most? I suppose. Certainly, I think I really enjoyed looking at early newspaper and print culture in the sort of early 1800s, specifically for an actor called Edmund Keane, who is my sort of favourite problematic douchebag. He was an incredible genius, a Shakespearean actor who redefined acting, but he was an absolute toxic bell end of a man. He was awful to his wife, awful to his son, terrible to his friends, but a genius. And there's some really interesting print culture that kind of gets to the heart of his incredible fame, but also sort of sums him up quite nicely. And there's a very beautiful image of him as Richard III, which is one of his most iconic roles, with the Drury Lane Theatre on his back, because he had basically saved the theatre. The theatre was in huge financial troubles, and he had arrived out of literally nowhere. Like, he's overnight famous, and I mean that literally. Like, nobody knows who he is, and then he's the most talked about man in London the next day. And so the Drury Lane Theatre is kind of saved by this weird bit of casting where they hire this random bloke they found in Exeter, and who's a kind of raging alcoholic, tiny man, a genius, a weirdo, and they put him on the stage, and he's amazing overnight, and they're like, oh, we're saved. And so this image of this theatre propped up on his back sort of just sums up this ego that would destroy him, because he became so self-obsessed with his fame, with his glory, with the people who had refused to acknowledge his genius before he was famous. He had such a chip on his shoulder, and I love that image. It just sort of gets to the heart of him and theatre culture at the time, and when I saw it, I just went, yeah, that's Edmund Keane to a T. So it's a beautiful piece of cartoon that tells you something bigger about the era, I think, and about the man.
I should have asked you instead instead of asking about your favorite weird historical fact, I should have asked who was your favorite problematic douchebag, because you had an answer ready to go for that one.
Yeah. Douchebags of history is a long chain. Yeah, I find him. I really root for him, even though he's been dead for 200 years, and even though he's awful. But because he'd had a very sad childhood, and because he really struggled to become famous and then suddenly had it thrust upon him, I just find myself going, come on, Edmund, come on, you can do this. Don't be an asshole. Just sort it out. And it's a very people often say biographers sort of fall in love with their subjects a little bit, which is a recurring problem, particularly if you're studying bad people from history. But he was the worst, but he also had charm and charisma and wit and extraordinary talent. And I just want to shake him by the lapels and go, Edmund, come on, man. You've got a lovely wife, a nice son here. Your life is great. Just stop being such a horrible man. But, unfortunately, he's been dead a while.
That's what that time machine is for.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. I'll go back and I'll just shout at him, give him motivational talk.
This is definitely an unfair question, but I ask it every time, so I'm going to ask it now. It says here, what are you working on next? But I don't think that that's a question I should ask you, because you've just finished 2 books, 2 podcasts. What you're working on next should be, a quiet weekend at home.
Yes, unfortunately, I don't really do quiet weekends at home. It's not really my thing. Yeah, I've just written two books in lockdown. One's out this year in October, I think, and it's called Ask a Historian, which is where I answer 50 questions from the general public in a sort of lively, fun way, hopefully. Um, we're making series 4 of You're Dead to Me, which is tremendous fun. I'm about to start work as a historical consultant to an animated show which for children, which I'm not allowed to tell you any more about, but that's going to be interesting. So that's a bit like working on Horrible Histories, but a slightly new challenge. Um, I've got a couple of ideas for other books, but I've got to write 2 more children's books. So my children's book will come out next year, and then I've got to write 2 more children's books. So it's a 3-book deal. Um, but I really, if I'm honest with you, I really want to move back into screenwriting and drama. It's where I started my career to a certain extent, working on historical dramas, and I love it. I love storytelling, I love film, I love television, I love that shaping of a story, and I love the kind of interplay between creative fiction and what do we know, and the work of what historians can do. And I've got a few stories that I'd love to be part of telling that, either writing them myself or working in production on those. So that's sort of the ambition, really, going forward, is to sort of shuffle sideways back into the world of television and film where I sort of started many years ago. But yeah, there's never really a day off over here, Shay, Castle Jenner. There's always something happening, unfortunately. But we'll see where we get to.
Lots for us to look out for then. Final question. What advice would you give to a historian just starting out?
It's hard, isn't it? Because there's so many things that people should sort of know. If I'm forced to give sort of one piece of advice, I think Twitter is a remarkable tool for thinking about what historians do, for acquiring new knowledge, for building networks and relationships. I'm hugely indebted to Twitter for meeting people like yourself, but I follow 10,000 people on Twitter, which is a slightly bonkers thing to do, but I love it. It's brilliant, and I can get any historical question answered in about 40 minutes. It's it's incredible the range of knowledge out there, expertise, and generosity of scholarship, and so a young historian who's sort of trying to find their way, I think Twitter's a wonderful place. Obviously it's toxic as hell and it's a sort of hell site of sort of horrific trolling and misogyny and racism and all sorts of horrible things, but as a place to be as a historian, it makes me a better historian, it makes me a better writer, it makes me a better person on a daily basis. I spend a lot of time on there and it makes me rethink what I think about the world, it makes me re-examine what I'm working on. It changes my mind on stuff. It opens my eyes to new stories and subjects and approaches, and I can keep abreast of kind of the big debates and arguments and scholarship and the where things have got a bit testy and awkward. But it's a fantastic portal for just talking to my fellow historians about what we love and what we care about, what we fear, what we're doing next. It's really, really helped me, and I'm very grateful, enormously grateful to Twitter and that network. Every time I write a book, there's 20 historians who give up their time to help me fact check it. Incredibly generous, incredibly kind, and obviously I will offer to do the same back if I if I am knowledgeable in that area, which I'm usually not. So that I suppose is yeah. If that's the one piece of advice, is that it makes you a better writer. Write short, funny, pithy things. Do it in 140 characters. Do it in 280 characters. Do it in a meme. Can you communicate the French Revolution in a GIF? Well, I think that maybe you can. Maybe there's ways. Maybe you can sum up these enormously complicated things in a very simple, idiomatic style. I don't know, but it's definitely made me a better historian, and to that I'm very grateful.
Well, thank you so much, Greg, and thank you, Twitter, because yes, I think we initially connected on Twitter. But
Probably,
thank
yeah.
you. Yeah, probably. I think
I can't
most of
remember. It's been a while, isn't it? Maybe we met at a book launch, but I think it was Twitter.
I think we met on Twitter and then sort of met then subsequently in person going, oh, I know your face being this big.
Yeah, I have a very distinctive weird face. I look like a sort of human weasel, so it's quite easy to spot me from across a room. Yeah.
But I think it was Helen Castor's book launch is I because I was thinking about this and
Yes.
I think it was Helen Castor's book
Joan of
launch
Arc. Yeah.
for Joan of Arc. Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we did Inside Versailles in a very, very cold church
Yes.
sometime
Yeah.
after that.
Yes, that was fun. Very cold
Well, thank
church.
you so much, Greg, for coming on the podcast and for sharing your insightful thoughts about history and your own process. Just a
Pleasure.
reminder, if you want to hear more conversations with history makers like Greg Jenner, do get on Twitter and subscribe to Follow Primary Sources podcast. Yep. And follow Greg and his podcasts while you're on there as well. And we're also on Instagram and wherever else you can find podcasts. You can also suggest future guests and send along quick fire questions to grill them with. Thank you so much for listening to Primary Sources.